So the topic of this talk is prospects for modeling culture as a complex adaptive system. A little bit about my own background. I came to complex systems sort of indirectly. My background is originally in physics and economics, but my doctorate is actually funded by the Humanities. And a few years ago, the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US funded a workshop that was focused on the use of computer simulation for humanities research. And it was a very sort of open-ended endeavor. I think they really were just throwing a methodology at a set of disciplines to see sort of what came out of it. So I think the application of this sort of lens and set of methods to culture is relatively limited. And I guess what I should ask is, I wasn't quite sure how to pitch this talk. So a couple of quick questions in terms of where I should spend time. Are people familiar with, by just a show of hands, how many people are familiar with Axelrod's dissemination of culture model? Okay, like maybe 40%. Brian Arthur's L-Farol model? Like similar? Okay, all right, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of things. First, just what it means to attempt to model culture as a complex adaptive system and what some of the problems are. My understanding was that some of the people in the room are also policy-oriented, so I'll sort of dip in occasionally to sort of how this issue is relevant to policymakers. And then a lot of this is going to be focused around just sort of large-scale concepts that are relevant to modeling culture as a CAS, and I'll do that through a few of the illustrative models that I talked about. So the first really big stumbling block is that culture is a famously ambiguous term. A 1952 study by Kroeber and Kluckhorn found more than 100 definitions. We're 60 years on from that. There is not general agreement about what culture means, and particularly when you look at the complex systems models. Thank you very much. When you look at the complex systems models, there tends not to be agreement within that research either. And so as a result, the definitions of culture and the treatment of them in terms of the modeling tends to be fairly idiosyncratic. So you'll see CAS-based models that define culture as a belief or opinion. That's probably the most common, or as a set of traits or memes. There's a large body of computational cultural diffusion research that sort of assumes that definition of culture. Culture is occasionally defined negatively, essentially as that which cannot be explained by genes or the environment. So if anyone is familiar with the artificial Anasazi model developed by Epstein and Axtell, essentially their culture is just whatever can't be explained by changes in agricultural yield. Culture as social learning or social influence. When we get to the Axelrod model, that's essentially the idea that culture is defined really sort of formally just as the thing that social influence influences. Culture is frequently defined as norms of behavior, so there's a large body of work on iterated and spatialized prisoner's dilemma, looking at the development of cooperation and trust. Those are considered to be cultural models, and sort of the list goes on. And so one of the first, I think, major problems, and I'm not going to solve this today, but I think it's something going forward for the field to think about, is first of all the lack of a generally accepted definition of culture is a major obstacle to developing any kind of holistic picture of how cultural systems function. So I think one of the first things that really needs to be done here is defining what exactly is meant and how these different types of definitions interact with each other. And second of all, there isn't a generally agreed upon set of underlying fundamental mechanisms. So again, what you'll see in a lot of the models is that they take a relatively idiosyncratic perspective, or that it'll sort of select out certain subportions of research that don't necessarily speak to each other. I think in terms of the kind of explanandum that ideally complex systems modeling and culture would be able to address would be something like this. This is the World Values Survey, which has been conducted for the last 25 years. These are questionnaires that go out to people in different countries around the world, and then they're mapped in this sort of conceptual space. And you'll see each country is mapped against two axes. The vertical axis is traditional values versus secular rational values, where traditional values tend to emphasize religion, parent-child ties, deference to authority, things of that kind, and tend to be relatively intolerant of divorce, abortion, et cetera, versus secular rational, where there tends to be less emphasis on tradition and more acceptance of more sort of liberal social policy. Along the x-axis, survival values on the left, these tend to be places where people are more focused on economics or physical security, versus self-expression values, where people tend to be more focused on well, issues of self-expression, freedom of expression, et cetera. So I think sort of, this is one example of something that I think ideally we would want to be able to generate a set of models and mechanisms to explain. There's been a little bit of work in this direction, which I'll describe. But I think it's this type of phenomenon that really the field has still not, sort of developed to the point of being able to explain. Along with that is sort of how these things develop over time. So what you'll see is that cultures, at least from a values perspective, tend to change, but change gradually. So there are sort of consistent signatures over time, but there is movement. I think this survey is also itself laced somewhat with certain Western values, because I think movement into the upper right-hand corner is considered to be a kind of positive development. If George Lakoff were here, I think he would have something to say about why secular rational and self-expression end up on the upper sides of the graph rather than the lower sides of the graph. But that said, this is the other type of phenomenon that I think culture as a caste should be able to explain. And lastly, this is sort of digging underneath the hood. This is work that was done by Jenna Bednar and Scott Page at the University of Michigan, sort of taking apart some of the data from this survey and looking underneath the hood. And what you see is that these are the actual individuals who answered these surveys. And what you see is that, first of all, there's clear intercultural diversity. So there's a different cultural pattern for different groups in different countries. There is in-group homogeneity to a certain extent, right? There's a particular location in the graph where the values of Swedes tend to reside and the values of Zimbabweans tend to reside. But there's also intracultural or within-group heterogeneity. So there's still a fair amount of diversity. Like not every Swede looks exactly the same. So I think this is an example of the type of thing that I think we should be reaching for. Culture, in particular, I think, is extremely appropriate for caste modeling. This is sort of a list of the common features that we tend to look for in complex adaptive systems. Diversity, systems in which the components are non-homogeneous, right? And people's values tend to be highly non-homogeneous. Diversity is a major issue within cultural studies. Aggregation, so systems that have features of hierarchy or hierarchical organization of boundaries. Internal models, so systems in which the agents themselves have some representation of the system that they exist in, and that's tied into, as well, adaptation, systems in which the agents are able to modify their behavior in response to the environment. And I think all of these are things that we find in culture related to policy. I think another major area that needs to be explored is the relationship between culture and policymaking, which I think is fairly poorly understood. I pulled this out of an article that I was reading by Brookings the other day. Culture's future influence on world politics will be in a way that has long been shunned as a basis for analyzing policy values. Most Western policymakers have thus far presumed that certain universal traits govern international affairs. Culture was seen only as an incomprehensible wildcard of little relevance to the game of international relations. Culture influences what goals are considered worth striving for, what tools of statecraft are used, what national image is sought, and how concepts of war, peace, freedom, equality, livelihood are valued. So I think currently in international affairs discourse, for example, the role of culture, and this was pointed out this morning, is relatively underexplored. Culture and policymaking interact in a variety of ways. Culture is an object of policymaking with respect to things like arts and cultural funding, or at the extreme end, propaganda and social engineering projects. This is where policy is attempting to act directly on culture. Culture also functions as a constraint on policymaking. So to achieve policy objectives, policymakers need to frequently work around and within the beliefs and cultural practices of the population. I'm thinking here about, for example, the public health issues last year around the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and one of the major issues around dealing with it in that context was to achieve the policy objective of eliminating the disease. They needed to work within existing cultural norms about burial rights. And lastly, culture is an ideological lens for policymaking. Values, beliefs, and assumptions of a culture affect how policymakers conceptualize how the world works, what problems are worth designing policy for, and how those issues should be addressed. The kinds of policy solutions and policy problems that are defined in the context of Confucianism are extremely different than the kinds of policy initiatives that are envisioned under liberalism. So, okay, so that's the background and why you should care about this issue. Okay, so the rest of this is going to be focused around big concepts and a few sort of basic illustrative models. Axelrod's dissemination of culture model, I should say I'm extremely aware that I'm probably not the best person in the room to be talking about this because Ross Hammond did his doctorate under Axelrod, and I think has co-authored a number of papers on this issue. So if I mess anything up, Ross, please speak up. But there are a couple of major insights from this. First, that culture is or can be emergent, that local bottom-up rules for sociocultural interaction are adequate to generate global patterns of cultural similarity and difference. And second, the model provides some insight into in-group and out-group formation, as well as factors that impact the level of cultural homogeneity versus diversity. So Axelrod is building on one approach to modeling culture, which is the concept of the meme. Comes from Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and essentially it's by analogy with the gene in the same way that genes are intended to be or understood to be units of units of biological transmission that are both reproducible and subject to selective pressure. Similarly, by analogy, Dawkins posits the idea of a meme as a unit of cultural transmission. This is a flawed concept, but it's been very influential in cultural diffusion modeling. And so the sort of general approach, and you see this used a lot in complex systems modeling of culture, a sort of a diffusionist perspective in which we imagine that culture can be dispersed or atomized into a set of individual features that can kind of propagate through a population. Somewhat less explored is the sort of integrationist perspective on culture, that culture is a sort of a package in which traits have embedded relationships to one another. There's a little bit of work done around that by people in philosophy like Paul Thagard. But at least in an explicitly caste context, this has been a sort of much less popular approach. Again, memes have a number of major problems. Probably the leading one is that memes tend to be regarded as having no relationship to each other. But still, they provide sort of a useful straw man and way in to thinking about modeling certain aspects of culture. So Axelrod begins from a set of general stylized facts about culture. First, that cultures are organized into, as we saw before, global patterns of similarity and difference that are defined both by heterogeneity between cultures and homogeneity within cultures. And second, that cultures are a product of social learning or influence. So whatever, regardless of the actual content, which Axelrod brackets off, we can look at culture as sort of the thing that social influence influences, that culture is something that is learned or shared between individuals. So a couple of key questions. First, how does a culture get established, spread, and sustain itself? And second, what gives rise to these patterns of similarity and difference? I'll skip over this next part. So the approach, first of all, is to identify candidate mechanisms that are capable of generating cultural similarity and difference. And there's sort of a laundry list of them. The two that Axelrod zeroes in on are first homophily. So the tendency of individuals who already have like interests or shared cultural features to gather together and interact more. And second, conformity or social influence, so the tendency of people's beliefs to adjust so that they can form to the beliefs of or cultural practices of the people with whom they're interacting. So here, something around the contact hypothesis is sort of what's being invoked. The idea that when people who are culturally different interact, they become more culturally similar. And you can sort of see, really even just from the construction of that there's a sort of built-in positive feedback here, where people who are similar will interact more. People who interact more will become more similar. And then but there are still some unpredictable aspects of this, and so Axelrod instantiates it in an agent-based model. So just a sort of quick overview of the way that the model works for those who haven't seen this before. Agents basically have two properties. First, a cultural vector, so a set of sort of simple features. That's just a list of numbers. This vector can be of more, greater or lesser length. That's the number of features, and each feature can have a variable number of different traits. So here, this is 3 different traits, 0, 1, 2, right? We could expand the number of traits. Second, the agents, this is a spatialized model. The agents are anchored in space, and Axelrod suggests thinking of this as interaction between villages or sort of agents that can't move. And then the interactions are probabilistic. So if we have, for example, 2 agents that share 2 out of 5 features, the probability of their interaction is directly proportional to that. So here would be a 40% probability that these agents will interact. If they do interact, one of the agent's traits is changed so that it matches the other agent. So this is sort of the way that we cash out this idea of 1, homophily preference for individuals who are similar to us, and 2, social influence, the transformation of one's cultural traits to match those that you're interacting with. Just very briefly, this is what the model looks like when it's run. So this is running it for a large number of features and few, and that is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Sorry about that. Sorry, one sec.
One of the things I might, and this is like the radio call continuity man who fills in when the airwaves go silent. And just to mention a couple of things which I might say now before we'll depart. We're not going to have a closing remarks. The only closing remarks we were going to make is to meet downstairs at 6:15, and that's 6:15 sharp. So for those of you who are used to digital, it's when the little hand is pointing down and the big hand is pointing to the right. That's when the bus is going to leave. It's down for us walking, but for some reason they decided to have a bus. I think it's because it's really raining very heavily. And now the continuity man will now sit down and hand back to the program.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you. So essentially, I won't show a run of the model, but basically what happens is initially a set of areas in which individuals are capable of interacting zones form, and then gradually homogeneity takes over. So what you'll see is that zones, which are patches where individuals can interact with each other, where they share at least one feature, sort of settle first, and then gradually there's sort of a kind of fight between cultural variance within those regions until they settle down. The model also provides some insight into the set of levers that impact the level of homogeneity or heterogeneity in a culture. So for example, as the number of features increases, the number of attributes along which individuals can be similar increases, and consequently interaction becomes more likely, and cultures tend to become more homogeneous. Likewise, as the neighborhood size is increased, the number of individuals that one interacts with increases, and therefore a culture tends to become more homogeneous. So again, sort of this is a very simple model that I just wanted to start off with as sort of a baseline or straw man. The main thing that it illustrates is, first of all, that simple mechanisms are adequate to grow cultures, that cultures can be expressed at least computationally as emergent structures that arise out of self-organization, that global patterns of cultural difference can arise simply through local rules, and the model does provide some purchase on understanding what drives diversity and what drives homogeneity. There's essentially an entire industry that's been devoted to variations on Axelrod's model. The original model was intentionally constructed to be very simple, and there are a wide range of different variations on it, running this on networks or lattices rather than lattices, relaxing the non-local interactions, different types of mechanisms, et cetera. But let's move on to the more interesting stuff. So, so first of all, much of the work that's been done in complex adaptive systems modeling of culture grows out of that model or in some way responds to it. That's not exclusively the case, but I would say a fairly large body of the work is focused on that. So much of the rest of this is going to be about sort of other approaches or issues or questions or models that I think sort of point the way to other things that can be explored here. This is a slightly different gloss on the Axelrod model. I want to start with a framework for thinking about complex adaptive systems modeling developed by John Holland. So the idea behind this is that what Holland was interested in is mechanisms that underpin the development of hierarchies. And the idea was that caste systems can be modeled using a framework that's based on the idea of signals and boundaries, and that this type of framework is particularly useful for looking at issues of hierarchy, specialization, diversity, and niches. And the idea here is that signals represent agent-to-agent communication, and that agents are defined by boundaries that are semi-permeable, that certain types of signals can pass through boundaries, and other types of signals are prevented from entering, and that essentially agents in complex adaptive systems can be looked at in terms of systems of signals and filtering boundaries, and in turn that this provides a lens or framework for looking at the formation of hierarchical structure. Hierarchical agents are defined by systems of enclosing boundaries. A couple of examples of this. The sort of canonical example would be something like a cell, where a cell can be thought of as a set of hierarchically enclosing boundaries, where interior boundaries define organelles. Signals in this case would be proteins or other chemicals that can pass through outer membranes, but not necessarily into interior membranes, where and so essentially what we end up is sort of specialized regions of space that are focused on particular reactions, or states understood in terms of the political borders that define them, and then the signals, in this case being tradable goods that can pass through these borders, immigrants, diplomatic wires, et cetera. And the borders in this case regulate what types of signals can enter or exit. I think this is particularly relevant for thinking about culture. So harking back to this diagram from earlier, here cultures are defined by conceptual boundaries. Right? So this is a conceptual map based on boundaries in the conceptual space defined by survival expression and traditional values. And there are particular regions that define different cultures. The boundaries here would be things like taboos, stigmas, heresies, or simply ideas that are rendered inconceivable because they're incompatible with the existing ideological structure of the culture. Boundaries filter signals, ideas or behaviors that are forbidden or rendered incoherent. And cultures in turn are aggregates that enclose both people as well as, in this case, countries. And I think one of the nice things about the Axelrod model is it is quite reconcilable with this notion of culture being signals, being defined by signals and boundaries. That Axelrod's model depicts actually how cultural boundaries and cultural aggregates form. Cultural traits in the model actually serve two functions. First, they're signals, they're units of cultural information that move through the grid, but also they function as tags, elements of boundaries that signals need to meet in order to cross the boundary. And that signals actually become tags once they're passed from one agent to another. These tags lead to the formation and dissolution of boundaries. More permeable boundaries define what Axelrod calls cultural regions. Less permeable boundaries define what Axelrod calls cultural zones. And ultimately, what we end up with is the movement from something that looks like that to something that looks like that, the reconfiguration of boundaries based on the passing of traits. And ultimately, we end up with, in that one, 3 different cultural aggregates where each individual cell is defined by an individual agent boundary, and then the cultural collective is defined by the external black lines there that mark off cultural boundaries. Okay. So one of the issues with the Axelrod model is that, again, the culture is represented as a set of independent traits representing beliefs or practices. This is a way of representing social influence, but there's really no sort of tie back between beliefs and any sense of reality. So it's a reasonable account of certain types of cultural phenomena, so similarities and differences in language or fashion or cuisine, but it's not a particularly good account of other meanings of culture, particularly the idea that one's worldview or ideology, how we perceive and understand and shape a reality is a part of culture. And I think for that, we need a different type of model in which culture is represented by internal models rather than traits. So the idea of an internal model is a set of rules that enables an agent to anticipate the consequence of its actions. You could think of an internal model as being an interior representation of some type of external environment or system. And particularly, it's something that enables prediction. So you can imagine, for example, the internal model that you have when you're playing a game of chess, where you understand the set of possible moves that are available, the types of things that your opponent might do, and you can sort of project forward in time and evaluate different strategies, that you have some internal model or representation of how chess operates. And often these are based on heuristics, particularly when agents are trying to themselves develop some type of internal model of a complex system, that frequently they won't have an accurate model, they'll have some sort of simplified pattern-based heuristic for understanding it. So the L4O model works as follows. So this is based on a famous bar in Santa Fe that's occasionally extremely crowded. People like to go dancing there. And the sort of stylized version of it in the model is we start off with 100 people who will decide independently whether or not to go to the bar to dance, but the bar can only accommodate 60 people. So if more than 60 show up, there's a problem, no one is satisfied. If less than 60 people show up, those people get in. So the idea is that each agent is attempting to develop their own predictive model for what the attendance is going to be, whether or not they expect that the attendance is going to be more or less than 60, and the information that they all have, the only information that they have, is the attendance history. So the first point here is that there are a huge number of predictive models that are possible here. The moving average for the last few weeks. The attendance this week will be the same as the attendance 2 weeks ago or the attendance 5 weeks ago. Mirror images. However much the attendance was above 60 last week, that's how much it will be below 60 this week. There's a wide variety of, or just a fixed number. I expect that every week the attendance will be exactly 60. There are a huge range of different models, and the thing is that there isn't actually a single correct model that can be rationally deduced here, because the correct model is based on what everyone else's model is. So unlike a sort of standard global optimum problem, there simply isn't a global optimum here. It depends completely on what other people's predictive models are. And then the other assumption in it is that individuals have a sort of suite of predictive models that they can base their predictions on, and they'll sort of track the performance of each of them and opt for the one that seems to be working best. The idea being that people keep track of a number of different heuristics for understanding different systems, and that we sort of grab the one that happens to be performing relatively well at a given point in time. So for fear of this crashing again, I'm not going to actually run this, but what you would see if I ran the video is that mean attendance converges. Actually, I might be able to run it. I know it's dangerous. I think it's more illustrative if I can run it though. Yeah, okay. So let me just run that one more time. So this is the mean. This is the percentage of people who would stay home. This is the percentage of people who would go. This is the attendance. 60 is marked by the red line as the average, and then this is the different sets of active predictors or active strategies that people are using. So what you'll see is that the model quickly converges to the optimal attendance, which is 60, and that it finds a balance between predictors that are anticipating greater than 60 and less than 60. So essentially the model finds, even though everyone has a different predictive model, collectively they're finding an optimal solution. One of the particularly interesting things here is that although the aggregate, the set of internal models that individuals have converges on an outcome of 60 with some amount of variance, the actual predictors that are being used cycle constantly, or not cycle constantly, but evolve and change constantly. So we have both the system converging to stability in one sense, but continuous evolution and change in another sense. And I think we talked a little bit this morning about Soros's concept of reflexivity, and I think this model is a really elegant example of reflexivity in action. Since we were bringing it up this morning, the concept of reflexivity is, in effect, a two-way feedback mechanism in which reality helps shape the participants' thinking, and the participants' thinking helps shape reality in an unending process in which thinking and reality may come to approach each other, but can never become identical. Knowledge implies a correspondence between statements and facts, thoughts and reality, which is not possible in this situation. The key element is the lack of correspondence, the inherent divergence between participants' views and the actual state of affairs. It is this divergence, which I have called the participant's bias, which provides the clue to understanding the course of events. That is, in very general terms, the gist of my theory of reflexivity. So the idea here is there's a few points. First, what participants believe about the way that a social system operates changes the way that the social system operates. But one point that I want to clarify that I think didn't come across clearly this morning is that there's sort of two ways that this can happen, and Soros is only talking about one of them. So there's a difference here between models that essentially function like self-fulfilling prophecies, so models that actually make themselves more true when everyone adopts them, and what Soros is talking about, which are essentially self-defeating prophecies, so models that end up rendering themselves false when they're broadly adopted, right? So there's a book that some of you may be familiar with, An Engine, Not a Camera, which is a sociological study of the adoption of the Black-Scholes pricing model during the early 2000s. And this is an example of an internal model functioning as essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. It sort of doesn't matter to begin with whether or not it was an accurate pricing model. Once it's been adopted by everyone in the market, that is how the price is determined, and suddenly the model becomes accurate precisely because everyone has adopted the model, right? That's actually entirely unlike what Soros is describing, and also the way that L for all functions, where if any individual predictor ever became totally accurate, everyone would adopt it, everyone would then attend or not attend on the same nights, and that model would automatically be rendered inapplicable. Right, so it's actually right. So those are two really different ways in which participants' beliefs can change the functioning of a system. One of them actually is not, in a sense, problematic. Right, if the model actually causes reality to conform to it, the other is and is wicked in some sense. And then, so the idea here is that in the sort of self-defeating case, we have the internal model, we have the system, and there's always a divergence. If there ever isn't a divergence, the functioning of the model is sort of undermined, and a divergence opens back up again. And that's exactly what happens with L for all. So why am I talking so much about this in the context of culture? Well, so one point that I want to make is that internal models, the internal models that we use are part of culture. And I want to refer here a little bit to George Lakoff's idea of how metaphors structure lived experience. So one of the issues with complex systems is that they're hard to understand, and consequently people tend to use heuristics. One of the types of heuristics that we use are metaphors, that metaphors function as simplified mental models. These types of metaphors that we use for understanding systems tend to vary culturally and historically. So if you think about the metaphor of the society's body, was a very popular, was a very influential model of the way that Indic societies functioned, or the way that European societies functioned. Later, that notion was well, for the most part, abandoned in most Western societies, or the idea of the economy as a machine that became popular at the end of the 19th century. If anyone knows the hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, it's still a metaphor that he uses quite a bit. Versus sort of more recent studies of the economy that are starting to use the analogy of the computer. Right. So these types of models, once they start to become the heuristics by which the economy operates, modify the way that the economy functions, and that these things are historically specific and culturally instantiated. So, in terms of the relevance for policymaking, so first, as a lever, changing participants' internal models of sociocultural systems changes those systems, and that is a powerful but also sort of dangerously unpredictable policy lever. But second of all, policymakers themselves are participants in the systems that they're modeling. And so I think one of the key questions in understanding the impact of a policy model on the function of the system that it's meant to model is the policy model that you're using self-fulfilling or self-defeating. If you're a policymaker assuming a particular way that the economy functions, if that becomes broadly adopted, is that model going to become more or less true? Right? And I think that's something that not much thought is given to. In the case where it becomes less true, then you're in this sort of world of a sort of Soros permanent uncertainty, where there's always necessarily going to be some type of gap between the model and reality, and full knowledge becomes impossible. So what's the best position in circumstances like that? It's some notion of epistemic humility. But I think that idea of what type of model is it is particularly important. Okay, so the other point on L for all. So it also illustrates the importance of cultural diversity. So in this particular case, it's a very extreme case where actually L for all forces what we might call cognitive diversity. Again, if everyone converged on the same model, that model would cease to be operative, and immediately individuals would sort of fan out, right? So in a sense, what the model requires is that individuals have different beliefs about the way that the system operates, that we need a set of internal models rather than a single model, that individuals have to have different perspectives. But 5 minutes? Okay. In addition, well, then I'll skip this. Okay. The last point that I want to get to is, so one of the points around L for all is the idea that we have a set of mutually co-adapting internal models, that sort of my belief is only valid because your differing belief is acting on the system, right? So the internal models that individuals have are sort of co-evolve together. And there's another model that I wanted to touch on that I think illustrates this even better. This is Christian Lindgren's Evolutionary Phenomena in Simple Dynamics. So the premise of this model is that we have a set of players who are engaged in iterated prisoner's dilemma, and gradually over time, their strategies can evolve by becoming deeper. So the idea is that we can represent individual strategies as genomes. So here, in a scenario where I'm competing against someone who previously defected on me, I cooperate. In a scenario where they previously cooperated with me, I cooperate. So this would be all cooperate rendered as a genome. And we can deepen the memory of these strategies. So this would be a case where I cooperate with an opponent who cooperated on the majority of the last 3 moves. So here, the genome becomes deeper. So 0 represents the case where this individual defected on me 3 times, or the next position represents the case where they defected on me twice, and then most recently cooperated with me. So what this allows us to do, so then the players play each other in round robin, they're scored, and then there's some replicator dynamics. Skipping to the interesting part, this is what you end up with. So I think this illustrates the notion of co-adapted, an evolving ecology of beliefs, actually somewhat better than Alfarol does. So the first thing to notice about this is that we have the emergence of, in a sense, intelligence over time. So what happens is, we start off with a set of simple, thank you. We start off with a set of simple tit for tat, and sort of inverse tit for tat. And then gradually we progress to strategies that exploit sort of deeper and deeper knowledge. And even though it's possible actually for these things to regress, they don't. So in a sense, sort of over time, we evolve towards greater intelligence or more sophisticated internal models. Also, we have cases of co-adaptation and mutualism. So strategies that are able to just coexist with one another for long periods of time, 0, 1, and 1, 0, or these cases, and then as well predator-prey dynamics. That looks remarkably like the output of Lotka-Voteller. Punctuated equilibrium, so there are long periods of time during which things are entirely stable and then abrupt collapse. Oh, yes, sorry. So we have long periods of equilibrium in which the strategies are relatively stable, followed by, in a sense, abrupt sort of extinction events in which a sort of new strategy mutation comes along, and suddenly the existing strategy mutations just disappear entirely. So I'll just close on this. I think there's a lot of potential for thinking and modeling much more deeply this type of ecological and evolutionary perspective on the way that cultures operate. This is just an example of from I guess what I would call political culture. So in the same way that strategies are co-adapted to each other, political platforms are frequently co-adapted to each other. And so what you'll see here, so this is the representation of seats held by different parties in the Bundestag. And what you'll see, for example, is that the Yellow Party, which I don't actually know which party this is, in a sense seems to be able to cooperate in coalition with either the Red or Black Party initially, and then at a certain point its niche is sort of displaced by the Green Party, which can ally with the Red Party, but not with the Black, right? So the idea that actually there's a variety of application of this that I think is underexplored. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Any questions at all? And if we could make sure the microphones can be switched on as someone uses them, that would be great. Any questions? Yeah.
I do have one question, which is sparked by your presentation, but actually I think it's more fair to be directed to everyone in the room, particularly everyone who spoke today. We've seen many types of models, many types of approaches to complex systems, but can we productively talk about types of complexity? Excuse me if this is like a really basic, stupid question, but yeah, new to complexity. But can we speak of like like the complexity in a cultural system as intrinsically different from a complexity of a transport system or the complexity of an ecological system? Or are they all actually just complexity and we only have different types of approaches to complexity rather than different types of complexity itself?
Yeah, so I mean, one important distinction is between complex systems and complex adaptive systems. So systems in which the agents themselves have internal models of the system, I think are categorically different. So cases like where you have economic agents who have a particular view of how the economy works that influences the way that the economy works are distinct, I think, from systems in which the individual agents don't have models of the system itself. But people may have more sophisticated answers than that.
On the other hand, there is I think there are some universalities. Universality, I think Feigenbaum found mathematically that you can take complex systems in completely different areas, and yet there are some very strange, inexplicable universalities. So I think the answer to your question is, is it just one complexity or is it different complexities? And the answer is a typical answer in complexity, and the answer is yes. If you read McKinsey Quarterly, you will see that they describe different complexities. Is that true? Yeah, it works. Yeah, why not? So I think it's both and in this particular case. And what I hope to cover tomorrow is what some of the universalities that might work across different systems in practice in companies. And it's such a new field. Is it a science? Is it an approach? I mean, 30 years, 40 years old, this science? And how long has physics been around for? Ever. Yeah. In terms of, being used. So this is very, very, very new ground. And I think if we ever get an either-or question, about complexity, if you answer yes, you generally get away with it.
Yes.
It's both and. Any more questions at all? I have a question for Graham. We've seen lots of different ways of modeling culture. And seeing culture as complex dynamics. The question I have is, are there any, for example, earlier we saw ABM and how medicine has used that to model outcomes, and not in a predictive way, but in an influencing way. I've got the economists there looking very skeptically at me. I think for the economist, if you can model the weather, doesn't mean to say necessarily you can control it. So I'm just wondering, has anybody actually used some of these models to try and influence in advance of events what might possibly happen? In any examples of that?
Specifically computational models of cultural phenomena?
Some of the stuff you've shown, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, no. I mean, the thing about cultural study is it historically is not even a quantitative discipline. I mean, it probably looks in a lot of ways more like medicine did in the middle of the 19th century or something. Where so just over the last 5 years, there's been sort of a big data revolution in cultural study, where suddenly very large cultural data sets or archives of text that are mineable for features have become available. And I think for the most part, what's been happening is people are still in sort of a paradigm of descriptive statistics and sort of pulling stylized facts out of large databases. And there's very little in the way of mechanistic modeling. What are the mechanisms that can give rise to the data sets and stylized facts that are being pulled out of the archive. So as far as I know, I mean, in terms of those models being highly developed, and two, being pushed out to policymakers in the private sector, I think it's still early days.
Yeah, maybe a slightly easier question than this. has anyone tried to use the data which has become available to start to try to infer people's internal models? And you could think that if you watched the attendance at El Farol for long enough, you might start to be able to figure out some kind of inference about what kind of internal models people are using. In principle, that sounds like it might be somewhat doable, maybe more than using it for control.
Huh. Do you mean specifically working from a sort of dynamics model like this? Like if you start from the observed behavior in a dynamics model, can you work back out again what people's internal models are? Or do you mean like actual observations of individuals in the world and trying to work back out what their internal models are?
Maybe both. I mean,
yes,
I think,
right,
I mean,
right.
I think more or less in any context at all, I think it would be quite kind of interesting. Just wondering if you know whether people have succeeded at that.
I've heard a few sort of initial attempts, and I mean, I think Ross, isn't there sort of a line of Axelrod's research that touched on these types of cognitive models?
Yes.
Yeah.
There is some work along the lines that you're describing, but it's still very early. Yeah. The other thing, I guess one area where this kind of modeling and its relevance to culture are being sort of used to try to manipulate systems is when it comes to political campaigns and their attempts to harness cultural memes for specific purposes, namely to get votes. And there is modeling of this type that's done in those campaigns and used for very practical purposes. So that would be one.
Mechanistic modeling or just statistical
mechanistic
modeling?
modeling.
Okay. Not familiar with that.
Depends who you ask. It's all proprietary. These aren't published models, right? Because there's big money. There's big money to be made.
They won't tell you.
Any final questions before we call it a day? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Indeed. And